This is the Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. I'm Billy Binion, subbing in for Nick. Our guest this week is Amanda Knox. In 2007, while studying abroad in Italy, she was accused of murdering her roommate, Meredith Kercher, in what the lead prosecutor claimed was a bizarre sex game gone wrong. Despite mishandled DNA, a coerced confession, and a lack of credible evidence, Knox was convicted and spent nearly 4 years in an Italian prison before being exonerated in 2015. Her case was a media spectacle that sensationalized every aspect of her life. I spoke with Knox about her views on true crime after her story became one of the biggest examples of the modern era, the psychological impact of being imprisoned for something she didn't do, what she thinks the US criminal justice system gets right and wrong, and what she has to say to people who still believe she's lying. She also shared a fascinating tidbit about her current relationship with that lead prosecutor, something that will be featured more in her new book, Free, which is currently available for pre-order. And now, to the Reason interview. Amanda Knox, thank you for talking to Reason.
Well, thank you for reasoning with me.
So you were arrested and imprisoned in November 2007. Mm-hmm. 2 years later, you were found guilty of a murder that you would ultimately be exonerated for. We know that wrongful convictions happen not just across the country, but obviously across the world. So there is someone somewhere right now who is trying to come to terms with what you had to come to terms with in those moments, processing it as we speak right here. What would you say to that person if they were sitting in front of you?
A lot of things. First of all, and it's interesting, I've had to have conversations like this with people before, because a lot of people who are in the midst of their own crises, whether they are the family members of the person or the person themselves, come reach out to me and ask me this specific question. The first thing that I would say is not what people expect me to say, which is there's a light at the end of the tunnel and it'll all work out. Like I never want people to think that you can rely on the truth ultimately coming out, because that is not something that we can count on necessarily. I can't promise that justice will ultimately result in any of these cases. What I do reassure people is that it is possible to live your best life regardless of the circumstances that you are in, and that your life is not over, even though you are going through what you're going through. There's no telling how it's going to work out. There's a lot of factors that go into that. There's luck. There's the right people showing up at the right time. There's the evidence coming through. There's technology that comes available. All of that plays into whether or not an innocent person is going to get out of prison and then successfully reintegrate into society. The thing that they always need to know, though, is it is entirely up to them to figure out how to be their best selves in these circumstances. That is their power, and no one can take that away from them.
So you're essentially saying, at least what I'm hearing, is that there is still life to be lived if you're in these awful situations.
Yes.
Which seems pretty remarkable, because prison must be a pretty horrible place, is it not?
It's 100% a horrible place. I think that message doesn't lessen the tragedy of what is occurring. And the way that I talk to people about this is, when I was in that space, I woke up sad. I spent the whole day sad, and I went to bed sad. That was just my emotional default setting, which was very new to me. I was a very happy kid, a very happy person up until this circumstance happened to me. And that didn't change the fact, though, that there was always something that I could do in any given day that would make it worth living. And I couldn't plan ahead of time, the next day, what am I going to do to make life worth living? I could, in this very day, in this very moment, ask myself, okay, what can I do that is worth living for? And it might be something really simple, like writing a letter to my mom. It might be reading a book and educating myself. It might be doing as many sit-ups as I possibly could. There were always things that I could find that were meaningful to me, even in their humble ways, that made at least life in that moment worth living.
Do you find that that's transferable to people experiencing tragedies that have nothing to do with wrongful convictions and being stuck in a, concrete box?
Yes, I think it's applicable to anyone who's going through a horrendous circumstance. I've actually discovered that with time. I really thought that this experience that I was going through was very unique, and it made me feel very ostracized from the rest of humanity. That was part of it. That was part of the sadness, was feeling like I didn't belong to the rest of humanity anymore. And I slowly, over the course of years after coming home, have realized that we are all carrying our own private tragedies with us. And we all can feel trapped in the circumstances of our lives in a way that makes us feel like we don't have agency. We don't have a say in who we are or where we belong. And my message to people is, well, regardless of where you are and where you belong, there is something that you can do that matters to you, and do that. Find that and do it.
So I think it's important,
Nothing can stop
so
you.
much of what people understand about the criminal justice system and prison comes from stuff like Law and Order SVU.
Unfortunately, yes.
Right, exactly, which gives a very obviously a distorted picture of what life is actually like there. So for people, many people across the world know your name, but might not know really the day-to-day that you experienced for those 4 years before you were ultimately exonerated of killing your study abroad roommate. Can you just talk about that a little bit, about what you're talking about how you found purpose in prison. What were you experiencing that you had to overcome there just on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So a day in the life of prison. Um,
When you put
yes.
it that way.
Just what's a day in the life of prison like? Well, you are trapped in a box until someone opens the door, and that person typically is in a military uniform, and they are going to be shepherding you from one box to the next box where you are kept enclosed. You do not have agency over your body. You do not have agency over your possessions. There is zero privacy. So at any given moment, you can be strip searched. You can have your things taken away from you, your things destroyed. Um, it's so in that way, it's both deeply dehumanizing and utterly humiliating. Um, and at the same time, it's also banal, right? Like, you are just a body. You're just sort of a body there that they just have to keep in a box for a while. And it's very impersonal in that way. And you are there alongside other bodies that are just encapsulated for a while, and people are grappling with that, and that sort of the injustice and the dehumanity of that in different ways. Some people are like overly medicating themselves with the antidepressants or the methadone, whatever it may be, to get through the experience. And you'll see a lot of prisoners just sort of being comatose throughout the entire time. You'll find other prisoners who are really embracing the environment, and suddenly they're surrounded by a potential peer group that they can socialize with. And just typically these are people who are not in for a very long time, people who are sort of in the ins and outers, who can skate by with a year or two of this experience. They're not the ones who are facing decades and decades, and they'll be playing cards. And but even people who are there for a long time, like there's a social world that exists within prison, because it's so encapsulated. These are your people, whether you like them or not. You are just stuck there with them, and it's important to develop relationships, and you do that by buying people cigarettes and playing cards and doing little favors. I had a little prison hustle, which was to help people who couldn't read or write, and there were many of them who could not, to write letters to their loved ones, to read their court documents. So it's both horrifically, tragically inhumane and utterly banal. And yeah.
That last part is actually, I was wondering if you would say that, because the part about it being banal, because over the course of covering criminal justice issues for years, you talk to people who've been in prison, and one thing you hear from people who've actually been on the inside and, not just watch true crime shows, is that it's just really fucking boring.
Yes, it's
And
very boring.
Right. And that just time, it melds together and just absolutely drags on.
A single day will last forever, but then all of a sudden you'll blink and months of your life are gone. And you're just like, when did that happen? So like, it's the experience of time is very bizarre in prison, and it's one of the more difficult things to come back into the world with, because here we are living our lives, having things to do, emails to answer, phone calls, whatever. There you have stuff like in the idea of time, like you have ways to spend time, and time has in a way becomes like cheap. I don't know. Like there's this very different relationship to time. There's a sense of urgency on the outside that you don't have when you're inside, because you're just stuck and you're trying to find ways to occupy your time that doesn't make you just want to bang your head against a wall.
Right. And then you also have written about some of the more kind of dramatic indignities that you experienced, constantly being solicited for sex by people who were supposed to be in, positions of authority. One of your cellmates attacking you and you not being able to defend yourself really because it would have hurt your chances in court, and the public perception of you, which was already in a dire place at the time. It's because you were ultimately exonerated, I feel like so many people would be immediately horrified by that. But we forget that that's also, wouldn't you say that's pretty terrible even if someone is guilty of a crime?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would argue that the indignities that so many people face in prison, guilty or innocent alike, are not doing any of us any good. I think a lot of the people that I met in prison felt like it's not like they were sitting there in prison going, yep, I did a bad thing and I just have to serve my time and, earn the trust back of society. No, they were sitting there feeling victimized and feeling like they could not wait to get back out and make the same mistakes over and over again, because a little bit fuck off. Like like there was this feeling of, I'm not sitting here becoming a better person. I'm sitting here being victimized all over again. And the stories of so many of the women, I was shocked. Again, like I'm guilty of being someone who came from a place of seeing the world through a law and order lens, because I didn't have access to the criminal justice system. I didn't know what the realities were like. And suddenly I found myself immersed in that world. And so many of the women that I was imprisoned with had been victims of crime long before they had ever committed crimes themselves. And so they were swimming in a world where crime was a part of the rhythm of life. And so was prison. And it was just like the indignity of it was, I feel like their sense of who they were and how they belonged to the rest of humanity was corrupted by a sense of victimization.
Right. And you hear like the classic response is, well, prison isn't supposed to be Club Med. But you look at the statistics, the vast majority of people are getting out of prison at some point. Very few people are there for life. So the idea that we shouldn't care about even the people who did commit what they were sent away for.
Yeah, I think it's what is the point, right? And I think that, some people might argue that vengeance is the point. It's just the point of justice is to make people suffer who made other people suffer, and that's the point, and that's the goal. And if that's the goal, if that's what you really think is what justice is and what our society needs, then sure, we're doing it right. But but if what you want is a society that is safer, that is attempting to address, the causes of crime in the first place, and is attempting to try to mitigate circumstances that might lead to crimes, that might lead to further victimizations of innocent people in the future, then you have to sort of take a step back from that righteous indignation you feel towards a person who committed a crime, and instead say, what is it that works? And what we're doing right now is not working.
Right. So for people who aren't super familiar with your case, essentially the Italian government accused you of conspiring with your boyfriend of 1 week and a man who you'd met one time in some bizarre sex game to kill your study abroad roommate at the time.
Right.
But the evidence, and for the people watching the video, I put evidence in air quotes, it was always extremely spurious. Mishandled DNA evidence, law enforcement lying under oath, and most importantly, a highly coerced confession.
Yes.
Where you implicated your boss at the time after, an incredibly stressful several days where you were screamed at for hours in a language you did not speak fluently. You were slapped several times. And at one point you got your period during the interrogation and you weren't allowed to use the restroom. What do people not understand about what effect that has on the mind?
It's the biggest obstacle I feel to justice in so many of these wrongful convictions cases, because coercive interrogations and what happens behind closed doors in police stations with authority figures who are hell-bent on getting what they want out of witnesses or suspects alike, that side of the criminal justice system is very dark and very scary. And I think that a lot of people like to think that if they were in my shoes, nothing short of being beaten with a rubber hose or threatened with, by being dangled out a window, would get them to implicate themselves or others in a crime that they knew that they were innocent of. And obviously the evidence, the facts, the research speaks otherwise, but speaking from personal experience, I can tell you that I have never been put in a position of doubting my own sanity like I was in the hands of those police officers. It was not just that I was scared or that I was yelled at or that I was hit. I was made to believe that I had repressed all memories of having witnessed a traumatic event, but that now I was being forced to unearth repressed memories, or else I would never see my family again. I was put in an impossible position where they reshaped my understanding of reality through lies and through manipulation, so that I felt like there was no possible answer besides the one that they eventually coerced me into signing on to, which was that I had witnessed my boss commit a horrific crime, and I was so traumatized by it that I could not even remember it. That was the story that they wanted me to tell, and it was all based upon a text message that my boss had sent me the night of the murder. And that was it. And once they had it, they latched onto it. I think they were under a lot of pressure to come up with answers. And because there is this psychological resistance to appreciating psychological coercion and psychological torture, there was a resistance to them once the evidence was at hand, and they saw that it was, oh, this guy who has a long history of breaking and entering, his DNA is all over the crime scene. Maybe that's the guy who did it. They held on to this idea that, well, Amanda confessed, so she must have witnessed something. she must have been there. Maybe she got them confused, like, or maybe she's a mastermind and she's cunningly subbing in one person for another. Like, there was a complete resistance to the idea that, oh no, they had just gaslit a 20-year-old girl into not even knowing what was the truth or not anymore. And I think that is a resistance that you see to this day. I mean, if you followed my case, you know that, like, I still remain wrongly convicted of a lesser charge, which is slander. I was, after I signed those statements, and it turned out that my boss obviously was completely innocent and had nothing to do with this crime. He had an ironclad alibi. Even after I retracted those statements, I was accused of having maliciously and intentionally slandered him in order to divert the course of justice. And I was found guilty of that crime, and I was sentenced to 3 years in prison for that crime. And technically in Italy, they say that I served rightfully 3 years in prison for the outcome of that interrogation. And I'm still fighting that to this day.
And I wanted to ask you about that. So that was the most recent development in this case. You went back over the summer. You were reconvicted. Why go back? Why fight it?
Well, I maybe this is just my personality, but I really do believe in confronting the things that scare you if you believe in yourself and you believe in doing the right thing. Like, I'm not a confrontational person, but I believe in confronting difficult things. I'm not someone who runs away. And so as I have fought this case, I felt that showing up to a court of appeals who was going to retry me on this case, because the European Court of Human Rights had ruled against Italy and said that my human rights had been violated, that I never should have been convicted of this crime. And that was enough for the Italian Supreme Court to reconsider that conviction and overturn it back in 2023. But they overturned it and sent it back for retrial. So I felt that in light of this new development, this was an opportunity for me to speak directly to the people who would judge me about the realities of these interrogations and this experience of psychological coercion. My fear was that because it's such a misunderstood phenomenon, that people would not know how to interpret my behavior or my experience. And so I felt like there is no better way for me to address that than by showing up and showing that I had nothing to hide and I could explain myself. I did that, and unfortunately it didn't go my way, but I am appealing that conviction to the Supreme Court. And actually just today, my attorneys filed the paperwork for it.
What is it like being back in that place after so many years and after such a traumatic experience? Years long. People forget, I think, that this lasted. I mean, you weren't exonerated ultimately until 2015. So this is essentially, what is that, an 8-year-long ordeal of your young adult life. I mean, I can only imagine going back there, despite not having to fear prison again, could not have been pleasant.
No, it definitely had some going to Mordor vibes,
Right.
like, which is funny because, like, it's the most beautiful Mordor you could possibly think of. It's Italy. But it definitely felt like I feared that I was stepping into hostile territory. And at the same time, over the years, there has been, even in Italy, a reevaluation of what happened in this case. There's a strong resistance to it, don't get me wrong, but I think that as a new generation has come into adulthood and has learned about the way the case went down and how a young person like themselves was turned into a monster on a dime based on frivolities, I think a lot of people have become a little bit either confused or even outraged, even in Italy, about it. And so a part of me walked back into Italy thinking, maybe naively, like, this is where I get to, like, belong to Italy again. This is when I get, like, this place that I came to because I loved this country and I love this language and I love this culture. Like, I And then I was, I grew up in this place. I was 20 years old when I was arrested. I spent 4 years in prison, 8 years on trial. Like, I grew up, and a part of me is Italian, whether I like it or not now. A part of me felt like, is this when I get to have good memories in Italy? Is this when I get to finally belong? And so when I did receive that verdict, um, I was heartbroken because, on the one hand, this was a very familiar feeling for me. I know what it feels like to pour my heart out in front of people who are employed to judge me and have them just throw it back in my
Right,
face
savage you.
and say, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
And so I know what that feels like. It was a very uncomfortably familiar feeling. And at the same time, I was heartbroken because a part of me felt like that part of my journey was over, and it's not. So I had a very tough car ride out of Florence, with my husband, processing how this story and this trauma is really not over. 17 years later, I am still being gaslit and punished for something I didn't do in this country. And I'm still fighting an uphill battle in many ways.
When you talk about, it's interesting to me to hear you say that you, like, going to back to Italy, may have thought that part of it could be over. Because when I hear about, I mean, I read your memoir, and when I hear about some of the things you experienced, like sitting in an interrogation room, having your period, and, having the vice commander of the prison constantly bring you in and ask for sex. I mean, as a 20-year-old, I can only imagine how horrible that would have been. And then, of course, just having 4 years of your life ripped away. Is that something that anyone can really get over? Because as someone who's never experienced anything like that, my assumption, I would say, no, I don't know how I would do that.
Well, okay, so to be clear, I wasn't saying that, like, the grief or the pain or whatever is over. I was more thinking, like, maybe my relationship with Italy and that sense of hostility is no longer there. Like, maybe I'm safe here is basically what I felt. And then suddenly I was reminded of how unsafe I am still. Um, I think that and I think this is true of any, like, big traumatic event that is really disruptive to a person's life. Um, I think that we carry the shock waves of that our entire lives, and they continue to hit us in surprising ways as we continue on and meet these developmental milestones of our lives. Like, becoming a mom for me unleashed a whole new wave of, like, PTSD from this experience. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was paranoid when I was pregnant that my daughter was going to live in the shadow of the worst experience of my life, because I felt that I was living in the shadow of the worst experience of my life. And I suddenly felt this incredible pain and feeling of guilt that I was passing that on to another generation. And I felt a huge sense of urgency to, like, resolve my feelings of grief and pain before my baby popped out of my body and I corrupted her with my grief. Like, I was so scared. And it's funny now, actually. My daughter is 3 now, and she's just getting to the point where she's asking questions. Because, my past is not a hidden thing, and occasionally it comes up. And sometimes I kid you not. So she likes it when I tell her stories. She'll be like, tell me a story about Bluey. Tell me a story about the Little Mermaid. Sometimes she
My
asks me,
favorite is The Little Mermaid.
yeah, right? It's amazing.
It's
We
a
sing
great
a lot of the songs together.
classic.
Sometimes she says, tell me the story of Mama going to Italy. And
It must be a gut punch.
it is. And I just have to say, like, well, Mama went to Italy and something really, really bad happened. Someone hurt her friend. And then Mama was hurt too. And my daughter says, why? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, and she's at that age where she's asking why, and I don't have an answer for her. And then she asks me why again. And I'm just like, I love you, baby. Sometimes, sometimes people, even with the best intentions, make mistakes.
How long did it take for you to come to that answer?
Um, I think the better question is how long until I was able to articulate that answer to myself? Because I do think that a deep, deep part of me, even while I was in the midst of the maelstrom, like really early on, um, I could not believe that the people who were doing this to me were doing it with malicious intent. Like, I did not think that they were like knowingly putting me through this as an innocent person. A part of me deep, deep down was like, they think they're doing the right thing, but why? And then I blamed myself. I thought, like, was my Italian not good enough? Was like, what is it about me that they don't like? I don't understand. Um, and then, over the course of years, I developed the maturity to realize that it's really not about me at all. It's about what's going on with them and, their preconceived notions about who people are and who they are. I mean, who they are and how this story and their choices say something about who they are, I think plays way more of a role in this than people give credit for. And it's one of those things that I try to point people to when they say, well, what was it about your behavior? And it's like, well, actually, I would love for you to ask the question, what was it about the choices that these prosecutors and these detectives were making? What was going on in their minds that led them to make the choices they made? Because really, honestly, I was a 20-year-old kid just doing what I was told. And I didn't have a lot of say in how things panned out. So if you really want to get into the psychology of this, I would start asking questions about the prosecutors and the detectives.
So over the course of your ordeal, you were called the Wicked Fox, you were called the Ice Maiden, and of course the most famous one was Foxy Knoxy, which I think a lot of people don't realize was a nickname on your soccer team and had nothing to do with
Yeah.
sex.
Yeah.
But of course it was misconstrued globally.
Unless you're a weird perv who likes 13-year-olds, but
Well,
don't get into that.
right. But apart from the name calling, I think the thing that's almost more troubling is the fact that the press consistently recycled information that the police and prosecutors would feed them uncritically. Evidence,
Unfiltered,
again,
yeah.
air quotes. It was just reported breathlessly across the world. What do you make of that when the job of the press is supposedly to hold the government to account and not to do its public relations? Because that's basically what happened in your case. And do you still think that's a problem today?
Yes. So I think that's actually the thing that the Netflix documentary filmmakers were really good at pinpointing was what this case revealed about the media ecosystem around criminal justice related issues, but also around all issues. Like what is going on in media right now or at that moment and to this day that instead of doing what we classically think is the job of journalism to investigate
Right.
and
Hold people to
filter
account. Hold the state to
hold
account.
people to account, hold authorities to account, it was just acting as a regurgitation machine of whoever was offering information. And I was shocked until I realized that the people who are writing those headlines and publishing those headlines are being rewarded for that behavior. They are being paid by us when we click on those headlines. And they are giving us exactly what we seem to want, which is not a well researched, thoughtful, balanced, uh, something that takes time and consideration and
Sure.
expertise
It's about
potentially.
being first and about just
It's
getting it
being
out there.
first. It's being first, it's being loudest, and it's tapping into these unconscious parts of ourselves as an audience that we may or may not want to accept or embrace, which is that deep part of ourselves that loves and Schadenfreude and that
Right.
enjoys the sort of lewdness and shamefulness of other people's stories and gets gratification out of that.
So you must have a very specific reaction then when you see a certain type of headline
Oh
that
yes.
I mean, what is that? I mean, to this day, I mean, I'm not even talking about like if it's about you, it's just some sort of, salacious or obviously very slanted angle. I mean, and that, as you mentioned, is applicable to tons of subjects. It's not just about,
All subjects
right.
can have this problem.
How has
Yes.
that affected your media consumption and how you see the world?
I mean, obviously, I have a little like red light that goes off. All the little red flags
Right.
happen. I also I'm very skeptical when I see even things that are not just like obviously scandalous headlines, but like I hate when there are just little like 1 to 2 second blips of this person said this. And I'm like, I know that they said this 1 or 2 seconds in the context of a larger thing. And that context is probably being stripped away for that soundbite.
Right.
So I don't know. Like I think that it means that I am just not I'm not a good customer for media outlets because I don't have a stomach for it and I just don't find value in it. That said, I do think there is a certain amount of media literacy entering into the broader public because I mean, in part because we all are now much more content creators. So in a weird way, we now that we've tasted a little bit of how like or we've seen a little bit how the sausage gets made, we're more aware of how the bigger sausages get made, and I think that's led some people to be more interested in a more transparency on the part of content creators for how they came about making the content themselves. And I think that's a really interesting turn that it's not just that we now know a little bit more how the sausage gets made, so we demand higher standards. We demand it's not that we demand higher standards, we demand higher transparency. Like you came to this like crazy outlandish conclusion, well fine, but tell me how you got there. I'm here for the ride. Like just show me, show your work. And I think that's interesting. I think there's also but it's also led to this another interesting turn, which is I'm just a content creator. I may be right. I may be wrong. Here's my opinion. And there's like that sense of journalistic integrity or authority has dripped away. And what has replaced it is a personality driven media where people say, oh, I trust Reason magazine, so I'm going to just trust that whatever they put out there is good and whatever Fox News is putting out there is bad, whatever it may be. And so it's a more of a personality or brand driven media than it is a just general like levels of media and media authority.
Do you think that's a good thing overall?
Well, I don't know. I think that it leads to really dangerous things. I think we saw that during the pandemic with, big media personalities driving certain choices and behaviors as they relate to science that they may not have the authority to do. Um, so I mean, it on the one hand, it's interesting that instead of there being very few gatekeepers, it's a more
It's very
broad demographic
democratized,
of
right? It's like everyone can
yeah.
have a bullhorn if they want it.
Yes, and everyone can have the danger is that everyone, like every audience member, can now find their media authority figure that
Right.
they want, and they can hold that person because they're authentic or transparent as an authority figure that they can trust and not do the work themselves of figuring
Right.
out whether or not that is a valid opinion or whatever it may be.
Sure, and I think a lot of that comes back to what you were saying about media literacy, right? Like having
Yeah.
the stamina and the time to, I guess, have like a balanced media diet
Right.
and
And
decide for
we
yourself.
don't. We
Right.
just don't, because we're inundated with so
So much
much
information.
crap. So I think that's the biggest danger, is a combination of these new forms of media and just the sheer amount of it, so that it's impossible to do your due diligence, honestly.
Speaking of media, I read something in the New York Times that was written after your memoir was released. And the article concluded like this: the injustice very likely done to Amanda Knox pales beside the brutal truth of Meredith Kercher's death, and no plea for sympathy will ever bridge the difference. I suppose the idea being that because there was another person in this story, Meredith Kercher, whose name, of course, should not be forgotten, because she experienced such a grave injustice, that you almost shouldn't be permitted to process or mourn your own injustice in public, despite the fact that you had no say in the fact that you were raked across the coals in front of the entire world. What do you make of that? Because I feel like that's probably a pretty common response.
It is a common response. And it's so common that I actually came up with a term for it, the single victim fallacy. This idea that in any given morality narrative, there's only room for one victim, and someone who may have experienced a different kind of victimization is there's like a zero sum issue, and the idea being that if I speak, because in people's minds Meredith's tragedy is interlinked and with my tragedy, there's this feeling that like somehow that means you're choosing sides, so you either care about Meredith's tragedy or you care about my tragedy. You're incapable of caring about both. And this is a logical fallacy. This is not true. You absolutely can care about the fact that young women get murdered when they are just minding their own business in their own homes, studying abroad. Like you can, this, like the real tragedy of what happened to Meredith is that this was a common thing that happens to women all over the world, where we are we are targeted and brutalized by men and treated as objects and then thrown away. And like that is a horrific reality that I almost faced, and that a person that I lived with
Right,
experienced.
because I think people do forget that if you had been in your villa, I mean, it's very conceivable that you also would have been killed.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for noticing that, because that I one thing that I like to say, because a lot of people think I'm just very anti, criminal, anti law enforcement, and I'm not. And one way I sort of defend that position is I was a victim, I was an indirect victim of crime before I was a victim of the criminal justice system. Like my roommate was raped and murdered by a person who broke into our home. Like that is horrific. And yes, it is 100% true that Meredith did not get to live past that tragedy, and I do. Like, I have my life, she does not. But does that mean that my life is somehow less valuable, or my pain is less because she had her life taken away from her? No. No. What happened to her should never have happened, and what happened to me should never have happened. And for me, that is very clear. And I feel, despite the fact that people will reach out to me and say, "Oh, you're getting married. You know who's never going to get married? Meredith. Oh, you're having a baby. You know
It
who's
just seems
never going
like
to have a
such an
marriage?" Yeah.
insane response.
I mean, my life is not held hostage by the Meredith's tragedy. I do not in my life have to answer and live in perpetual um like a shadow self, because like I am not Meredith's ghost. And is what I basically am feeling like people are projecting Meredith's tragedy onto me because I'm the one who lived and to go home. And a part of me gets it. Like a part of me understands that because I have felt that in a way. Like I have felt like me and Meredith both arrived in Perugia to do the exact same thing and to live the exact same house. And we are two sides of the same coin, and fate flipped that coin and landed the way it landed. And so a part of me does feel that I carry her ghost within me, but I feel it in a very different way than those who would project that really negative energy onto me. If anything, I feel a great privilege to exist and a sort of duty to live my best life because I have that opportunity, because fate flipped it in such a way that I got to survive studying abroad and she didn't.
And you were not only a victim of the criminal justice system, but she was your friend, right? I mean, you lost a friend. That's not
I
nothing.
did. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I didn't know her for very long, but we, like, as you do in these like study abroad experiences, like you immediately click with the people that are close to you.
Right.
And she
It's a
and
very
I,
intense
yeah,
experience.
yeah. And she and I were at very similar stages. We were the two English speaking girls in the house. So we had a lot in common. And we had some really fun times together.
Did you feel like you ever really got a chance to grieve that?
Um, it's been difficult because it's hard to grieve when you're trying to survive. I think there's that first and foremost. Grief feels like it's at a different level of your level of needs thing. It's a luxury to grieve. And so especially during the trial and the prison process, that was not something that I could afford. I was trying to survive. Um, it was when I came home and I started, and especially when my daughter was born, I have to say, um, that it just hit me that like in all those ways that like people were trying to use those terms to hurt me. Like she'll never get married, she'll never get to have kids, she'll never get to live her life. Like it was meant to hurt me, but it didn't. Like I was already aware of those things, and I was aware of the indignity of the way that her life ended. Like I know what it feels like to be treated like your life doesn't matter. And I'm just sorry that she didn't get to see the other side of coming through an experience like that. That was the last thing that she got to feel. Um and I would never wish that upon anyone. Um I do I do feel like there's like unfinished things about it though. Like I would really love to visit her grave. But I don't feel comfortable doing that until her family is comfortable with me doing that. So I don't know if that's ever going to be possible for me. And if that's the case, then that's we don't always get the right ending or the happy ending that we want, and I know that, and that might just not be in the cards for me.
I know you've written the Kerchers, but have you been able to speak with them, or has that not been something that they've allowed or wanted?
So far that's been closed off
Okay.
to me.
So, in learning about your case, I kind of came to the conclusion that Italy's criminal justice system is like a really big hot mess.
Oh, really?
Yeah, well, that's the high level conclusion. But for people who haven't gotten into the weeds, you weren't read your rights during your interrogation. You were denied a lawyer despite asking for one.
Mm-hmm.
You were held without charge.
Mm-hmm.
The prosecution had a lot of evidence from the defense. And most interestingly, your jurors, or to me at least, your jurors weren't screened for bias. They were picked digitally and just thrown into the case. So the safeguards, in other words, as someone who covers civil liberties and criminal justice in the U.S., it was kind of stunning to me that existed and that is just business as usual. What perspective did that give you on the U.S. criminal justice system?
Whew. Well, I didn't really know anything about criminal justice systems when I left for Italy. And so when I came home to the US, I didn't really have much insight into how close or similar or different it was to what I had experienced in Italy. Um, it was only when I met other wrongly convicted people who had spent time in prison here in the US that I got an education about what's going on here and what problems that we have. And in some ways, it made me appreciative of certain things that they did in Italy. Like, for instance, appeals are guaranteed in Italy in ways that they are not really guaranteed here in the US. And it was shocking to me that the average number of years that a wrongly convicted person here in the US spends in prison is like 14, and
Hmm.
I spent 4 in Italy. So there were certain things that I felt like, oh my God. And also, like, there are certain ways that Italy even failed to follow its own rules with my case. Like, I was entitled to, like, legally in Italy, I was entitled to a lawyer, and I was entitled to have my rights read to me, and I was, entitled to have my interrogation recorded, and none of that happened. That's
Sure.
why the European Court of Human Rights ruled against Italy, because it had failed to even follow its own
Right.
rules.
I suppose I
But
just mean like in the U.S., if you hadn't been read your Miranda rights, that's just like an immediate like, ooh, like that case is on. It felt like it took forever for you
yeah,
to get vindicated for the types of mistakes that in the U.S. would have been an immediate red flag. Does that make sense?
it does. Yes, it does make sense. Um, and at the same time, I can't help but think that, like, I've heard of horrific cases here in the US where similar things have happened, and it's taken years and years, like a
Hmm.
decade, for that specific crime to be corrected, because that person didn't have proper counsel, didn't have the resources to pay for a legitimate defense. And so, again, if the rules are followed, great. But if they aren't, and you can't if you don't even know what the rules are to begin with, how do you know how to protect yourself? Um, I think a lot of people find themselves in situations where they don't even know what their rights are, and they don't know
Right.
that they should have legal counsel there to educate them about their rights. And that's how a lot of people end up getting into trouble, is because I think partly our criminal justice system relies upon our own ignorance and the fact that we don't know what our rights are.
What do you think the criminal justice reform movement in the U.S. is doing well, and what do you think it's doing not so well?
So I think that something that it is doing well is also the thing that it's not doing well, depending
Okay.
on what criminal justice person you're talking to. Um, I do not think that it helps to make enemies, make more enemies than you need, or than you already have. Like, the things that I have seen that have worked the best, that have really benefited the most people, have been when criminal justice advocates and defense attorneys, whoever they may be, have found some kind of common ground and common purpose with the law enforcement community and the prosecutors, like trying to find the places where we agree
Right.
is actually a really important fundamental step.
Instead of,
Agree.
like, all cops are bastards or whatever.
Right.
ACAB.
Like and it's like I understand that that sentiment, but again, I also understand the sentiment of saying fuck prisoners, let them rot in hell. Like, I understand why you feel that way. Is it helping?
Right.
Is it actually solving the problem? Is it addressing the causes of wrongful convictions or crime or whatever it may be? We need to address, like, for me, I'm a practical person. I want to have an effective impact on the world that's actually going to accomplish my goals. And my goals are to live in a world where we can trust each other and feel safer and be able to trust our authority figures. Like it. And so again, I feel like there are lots of different ways to approach this. And one thing that I really care about, that I advocate a lot for, is for banning deception, that police
Right.
use deception when they are interacting with people that are either witnesses or suspects. Right now, police can just lie to you. They can lie to you and there's no consequences. It's just part of it. And I think that is incredibly damaging to their relationship with the rest of us. I think we are that idea that this is somebody that we can lean on and trust is corrupted by the idea that we know or we don't know that they can lie to us and just lie to our face. And I also think that it leads the police officers to feeling like they have some false sense of self-confidence in what is true or not. Like, they have this false sense of being able to tell if someone's lying or not lying because they have been trained to
Right.
lie, and they,
They have like a special scent for it or
yeah,
whatever.
and they don't. The research shows that they don't.
Right.
And that's dangerous. Like, I think the thing that I have found most reassuring is when I have talked to law enforcement professionals who acknowledge that it's unethical to use deception. And not only is it unethical, it's ineffective. It does
Right.
not lead people to, be forthcoming with the truth. It just invites more lies. And really, like, what you want is to just get people, what you want is to have a relationship with people, be they suspects or witnesses alike, where they want to talk to you. And if they lie to you, you have them on the record as lying, and you can take that as evidence. If they tell you the truth, then you can back that up in your investigation. All of that is helpful. And I love it when I hear law enforcement professionals being willing to, like, come to a place of saying, oh yeah, we do actually want to get the right guys in jail. We don't want the wrong guys in jail. We can all agree on that. How do we do that? Is something that we are doing and a practice that we are relying on actually getting in the way of what our stated intention is, which is to find out what the truth is and get dangerous people off of the street. And I think that when law enforcement are honest with themselves and put away that sort of jaded sense of, if it's coming from a defense attorney or coming from a criminal justice advocate, I automatically have to reject it. If instead there is this place of open communication, we can get things done so much faster and help people so much quicker. We can change laws without so much opposition and having to struggle for years in legislation to get through to people. I think that if we work together, we can help more people faster. And so I think that when I see criminal justice advocates quietly or loudly attempting to find common ground with the enemy, then that makes me feel really reassured.
So one thing you said just now kind of, caught my ear, which was, you love working and speaking with law enforcement who are very forthcoming about wanting to get the right guys. But there is definitely at least a trend in some places, and I think this did happen in your case, where some prosecutors, obviously not all, but some prosecutors will put legalism and winning and not admitting there was a mistake over very obvious and viable claims of innocence. And this is a thread I see, I know we were talking about some of the deltas between the Italian justice system and the US justice system. But this, I think, is not so far apart. And I think it's probably just, a question of human nature. There's, for instance, a case I've been, following for a while out of Missouri. Her name is Sandra Hemme. She confessed.
Okay, I'm not familiar.
So she confessed to she confessed to taking part in a murder like 40 years ago. She's one of the longest incarcerated. She was recently released over the summer, but she's the longest incarcerated female inmate, I think, in the country. Confessed under very coercive circumstances in a psychiatric hospital when she was on drugs. And as I said, she confessed, being there for this murder, that now she's like, I really had nothing to do with that. But the Attorney General of Missouri, despite all of these advocates and people coming and saying, there really is no evidence tying her to this crime. She was on drugs when she had this, so-called confession, again, with air quotes. And he had the only reason that she was released over the summer was because a court in Missouri threatened to hold his office in contempt. And so I just wonder what you make of that, because that was very similar to you when the guy who actually murdered Meredith Kercher, Rudy Guede, was, as you mentioned earlier, his DNA was all over the room. It was like the most obvious open and shut case you could imagine. But the prosecutors just didn't want to admit that they got it wrong in the first couple weeks. And I wonder why you think that is, why it's so hard.
Yeah. And you're right. And I think the thing that is most icky, one might say despicable, about stuff like that is when they use legalese like, we can't reopen this case because it'll traumatize the victims. The victims deserve closure. There's a million things that well, he may be innocent, but he got a fair trial, and you're not entitled to your innocence in this country. You're only entitled to a fair trial. So too bad for you. I've absolutely heard these horror stories of legal professionals making these legal claims that go against common sense and common humanity. And I do wonder what the hell is going on, that you could be so entrenched in your little ecosystem, in your little echo chamber, and so jaded that you are making such a claim that if there is legitimate evidence of innocence, that is irrelevant to you because of legal blah 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 blah. It's baffling to me, because I feel like you must have entered into this profession to help people and do the right thing. And then I think about when teachers get jaded and they stop caring as much about the kids that they're teaching, and they're just skating by and plugging in and plugging out. I wonder if part of it is the psychology of being jaded and just doing the job and really not seeing the humans behind the paperwork.
Right.
Another part of me wonders if it's fear. If it's the fear of what it means, fear, first of all, of public repercussions, if they were to admit having made a mistake, but also the really personal existential fear of having to reevaluate who you are and having your identity be questioned because you're somebody who does the right thing. You're somebody who is on the side of justice, and suddenly that is called into question, and your knee-jerk reaction is to become defensive and to dig in your heels and to refuse to acknowledge that there is a legitimate claim on the other side. I think that comes, if I had to guess, armchair psychologist over here, I would say that's coming from a place of fear.
Right. So I just looked it up just to make sure. I wanted to add some context here. Sandra Hemme's attorneys describe her ultimate confession as, quote, often monosyllabic responses to leading questions. And that led to over 40 years in prison for something that now pretty much... so many people on both sides of the aisle would say there was never enough to get such a conviction. But it is like, as you're saying, it's fascinating that some people just can't let it go. It becomes about winning as opposed to what, as you said, the job is supposed to be, which is getting justice for a family and keeping the community safe. Your prosecutor, Mignini, had his own criminal case.
Yes, while he was trying mine.
Right,
Yes.
which I think a lot of people miss.
Mm.
And, has this kind of stunning record of misconduct. So I'm wondering how you reconcile that someone who is supposed to enforce the law was effectively making him, or, attempting to make himself above it. I mean, what does that say?
Well, I think it says the same thing that it says that when we do that in our country, and I'm really very it's one of those great ironies where the people who are employed to hold others accountable refuse to be held accountable
Mm.
themselves. They really
It's
don't like
perverse,
to be
isn't it?
held accountable
Right.
themselves. And I find that deeply ironic, and at the same time, I wonder if it again gets back to that sense of it's tied into their identity, that their sense of who they are and their place in the world, and that knee-jerk defensiveness that comes in when someone calls them into question. Um, and again, fear, because they are very, very close to what the consequences for wrong action could be, and they absolutely do not want, while they inflict it on others, they do not want it inflicted upon themselves.
If you saw him today, do you know what you would say?
Yes, I do. Because I'm in contact with him.
Are you?
Yeah, yeah.
That's that's interesting.
It is interesting. I can't get really super into it. It is going to be a big part of my upcoming book, though. So, I have a book coming out in March called
Yes, for
Free.
free.
And a big part of it is why I decided to reach out to my prosecutor and what that ongoing relationship has been like.
That's
So
fascinating.
yes, I agree.
We were going to discuss your book, but I had no idea it centered around the prosecutor himself.
Well, it centers around, so here's the thing. It centers around me asking myself that very dreaded question of, oh my God, now that I've survived this terrible ordeal, now what? Who am I? How do I belong to this world?
Right.
How have I changed? What do I do? How can I define myself in a world that has defined me by the worst experience of my life and by a thing that I had nothing to do with?
Right.
And a part of that journey of reintegrating into society and reclaiming my sense of identity and narrative is in part what led me to make the choice to bridge that very, very perilous gap and make a connection with somebody who I didn't understand and really wanted to understand.
That is so fascinating. I don't know if you can answer this or if we need to. March 2025 is when the book comes out, and I will
Yes,
be.
March 2025. Pre-order, bitches.
And I will be ordering. But I mean, how could you have that conversation without just being filled with anger and bitterness? Because that's what my reaction, I think, would be.
I think anger and bitterness are valid emotions, and they are not the only emotions. I will say that.
Okay. Well, I look forward to reading. So as you know, as essentially, you were sort of the first true crime mega story of the modern age, I will say. Of course, true crime has had a place for centuries, but, with the kind of perfect storm of new media at the time, of social media, of the extremely salacious allegations that, of course, ended up being obviously untrue with the sex game and all these things that were tailor-made to grab people's eyes. Amanda Knox essentially, in some sense, kicked off the true crime craze of the modern era, which hundreds of millions of people consume. It's one of the most popular genres that
now you're making me feel responsible.
Oh, no, not you.
I'm just
talk
kidding.
to the tabloid press. Hundreds of millions of people consume. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the popularity of the genre, and if there is a way to tell those stories in a respectful and decent way that still has a place in the conversation.
Mm. Yeah, I get into a lot of that question on a miniseries that I did for Labyrinths called Blood Money, where I the ethics of true crime media today has been like a big thing that I've written a lot about, but I felt like I was curious about the history of it. Like you said, like I was wondering where this was coming from because a part of me didn't relate to it. Like I was not a true crime person before I became the subject of a true crime phenomenon, right? Like I was reading Harry Potter. I was not reading true crime novels, right?
Right.
And so a part of me didn't quite get it. And the more I looked at the history, first of all, the further I saw it go back, that true crime has been of immense interest since we have records of things
Right.
being written and published. Like as far back as even before the printing press, people were writing about crimes, about salacious crimes, crimes that were abnormal, that rose above just the tragedy, and instead were imbued with senses of that could be used by priests, for instance, to teach his flock about the corruption of Satan, whatever it may be, and this endless fascination with justice and what does justice look like? Does it look like a person burning at the stake at the end? Does it look like the victims finally getting to have a say in the courtroom? What is justice? Like, what does it look like? And I mean, what I see today, which troubles me, is that the worst experiences of people's lives are not just in the public interest or are talked about for the sake of, journalistic integrity reasons. It's infotainment. It's entertainment. And so often the people who have the most at stake in whether and how those stories are told have absolutely no say about it. And there's no qualms about it even by content creators, because in the history of true crime, it was even sort of looked down upon, the idea that somebody who is at the center of a horrific story could have anything objective or valuable input to provide into the creation of certain content around that story. And I think that in part I understand it, because there's this idea of like objective, impersonal journalistic integrity, and that's the only way that you can arrive at the truth. But of course, that's not taking into consideration that human beings are not robots, and we all come into certain stories, even if we are not directly impacted by them, with a certain perspective, and that is going to shape our understanding of what matters and what part. So like in my story, for instance, so many people who have journalistic integrity and objectivity thought the thing that matters was the sex game,
Right.
the supposed sex game, sex game, sex game, sex game. And it wasn't real. It didn't happen. And yet that was the journalistic integrity of the objective person. And I think that I have rebelled against this idea that someone like me has nothing valuable to say or to offer when it comes to how my own story is told. And I think about that a lot, because a lot of people come to me and want me to help them tell their story. And that comes with an incredible amount of psychological weight for me,
Right.
because I've had my story told by other people over and over and over again, and I have felt utterly exploited
Right.
in so many different ways. And I
There
would
was the
never
what the
want.
2021 movie Stillwater, right? That was loosely,
Oh,
and they didn't even ask you for, they didn't consult you at all, did they?
no, I found out about it the exact same time that everybody else found out about it. And when they started having headlines being like, movie inspired by Amanda Knox's life,
That must be
Amanda Knox.
so surreal. I cannot imagine.
it's frustrating. Again, it's frustrating because you're like, oh, okay, I guess once again I am being used. My life and the worst experience of my life is being used by others for their own, you know, their own profit making, their own
Right.
creative inspirations. Like, and it's not that I begrudge them that impulse, because we all are inspired by real life, and we all, that's just a reality of how creation happens. We are inspired by what came before us and what is within our eye line. And unfortunately, my story made headlines around the world for a very long time. So people were aware of it, and it, consciously or not, it entered into their creative process. And they knew that they could sell it because it had sold 1 million freaking newspapers already. So I get it. What I think made me sad about the Stillwater part was part of the way that they advertised it was they said that they had done their due diligence and gone out of their way to speak to the people in rural Vermont or wherever it was that they were saying Matt Damon was from, so that he could really get into the character. But they were advertising the movie based on me, and no one had ever bothered to even reach out to me to ask me about my experience. and and thought that was um I thought that was just revealing of the way the industry works and has worked for a very long time.
Would you have
And
wanted to help if they had reached out?
I don't know, I think it would depend on what their creative vision
Right.
was.
Right.
But like having the opportunity to be aware,
Sure.
um and to have a say, like I think one of the really dangerous positions that people like myself get put into is when content creators come to us and say, we're going to be making a podcast or a documentary or a movie based on your story. We're going to do it whether you're involved or not. So you might as well, if we need something from you, you might as well be involved. You should be involved. And if they don't need anything from you, they don't even ask at all. And I think that's where it's like very obviously exploitative, and it's not in the interest of it's a big red flag for me. And it's one reason why I actually agreed to do the Netflix documentary, was because the filmmakers, when they originally reached out to me, they said, hey, we're not going to do this documentary without you. And I said, okay, well, I don't want to do it. And they said, okay, we're not going to do it.
Oh,
And I was like, wow, you are the one and
right.
only filmmakers I have ever heard who walked away from all this footage and all this vision because they were like, it's not right to do the story without you.
Are you involved in the Hulu series coming up?
I am, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
The one time that Hollywood
Well,
actually
that's at least
invited someone like me to be an EP.
a slice
Yeah,
of it. Good.
it's cool. It's a really cool flipping of the script. And I think I have to thank Monica Lewinsky in a huge way for that, because like she really had this vision of like, also as someone who has had
Right.
her worst
Whole life
experiences
out
of
there.
her life out there and against her will and exploited, like she wanted to uplift people who are in my position to actually have a say in telling their own stories. And so I am finding myself in the extremely privileged and rare position of being a subject who has a say. And I'm taking that very, very seriously. And I'm really proud of the work we're doing.
So you have a delightful podcast called Labyrinths.
Well, thanks for listening.
Yes, of course. One of my favorite recent episodes, you interviewed Greg Lukianoff of Fire,
Yes.
who I also
Yes.
interviewed recently for a documentary we made on a free speech case.
Awesome.
You have a penchant for nuance and heterodoxy that I would not necessarily expect from someone who had gone through such a horrific experience. I mean, I think it's very understandable when some people, have these awful experiences and come back a little radicalized by it. But you are so delightfully, like, you had an episode on debating drug legalization, and you're talking to Greg Lukianoff about why everyone deserves free speech rights, and it's just so
I'm radically unradical.
Well, and it's just tempered in a time when it's measured rather in a time when the temperature in this country is so high. How did you?
I don't trust when the temperature is high.
Well, understandably, I guess, right? But I'm
Yeah.
wondering kind of your political ideology these days and how you came to arrive there.
Well, again, I have big red flags for false narratives and for black and white narratives, and I think that politics tends to do that. And so like I tend to be very wary of a story that's too good to be true, or a slogan that's too good to be true. And so, or an ideology that's too good to be true. I really do think that life is complicated and the answers to problems very often, especially if you find people who are so committed to what feels like a complete heresy to you, that makes me immediately wonder, what am I missing? Not how evil is that person, but what am I missing? And so I don't know. I think and I think it's in big part a response to how people talked about my case, which was like, obviously she did. Like the fact that like so many people signed on to a black and white narrative without asking questions, and without responding to the little red flags that were, popping up from the very beginning in my case, made me deeply appreciate that it's a very dangerous thing to get caught up in what feels like a tantalizing story. And the tantalizing story of the satanic sex game girl from America, like that was a story that was really entertaining and really fun for a lot of people, but it also wasn't true. And there are really, really dire consequences to getting caught up in the fever.
Right. In that vein, there are still people out there, after all of these years, after all of the evidence being aired, despite all of it, who still think you're lying. What do you say to them?
I don't. I mean, here's the thing. If somebody thinks I'm lying, I've learned that it has very little to do with me and a lot to do with whatever is going on with them, which I don't have control over. So I don't really worry about that unless it's in a courtroom, and then I'm fighting it. And here's the thing. I am actually a very open person. I'm pretty unfiltered here. And I'm not hiding anything. And I never have. So I feel like I also know that I'm not here. Like I have given myself the grace to not feel the burden of having to explain myself to every single person out there. I really don't feel that urge or that responsibility anymore. And I think that's in large part due to having met other wrongly convicted people. Before I did, I sort of felt this like great horrendous obstacle of like, if I'm going to belong to humanity again, I have to explain myself to every single person. And I have given up on that horrific, impossible task. I do not feel compelled to do that.
Well, on that note, Amanda Knox, thank you so much for talking to Reason.
Thanks so much for reasoning with me.